Infection and transmission rate of the virus is one of the crucial pieces of information that the scientists modelling the pandemic use in their predictions. And right from the beginning, modelling the scale of the outbreak has been at the heart of government responses. We are all living under the lockdown that is a result of decisions based on modelling. But Adam, this is a crisis that's constantly evolving. How do you model something like this?
Models are really a tool we can use to ask what-if questions. What if you change interactions in a certain way? What effect might it have on the outbreak?
You were one of the very first people who were modelling this outbreak back in January, right?
Yes.
And of course, there was one model in particular that got a lot of attention in the press, a model by Imperial College London, looking at the impact of different interventions. So this graph has got time along the x-axis and critical care beds up the side. This is the classic curve.
So what we see here is the scenario where everyone just carries on as normal and the epidemic continues.
Terrifyingly large.
Exactly, and this is looking at a range of moderate interventions. Things like school closures, having more people working from home, maybe people self-isolating when they've got symptoms. And you can see that all of these different measures will slow the outbreak, so it will mean that there's less transmission, the peak is happening later, there's a reduction in the size, but it's not a huge reduction.
Yeah. Even with all of those interventions, when you actually include the critical care line, this is kind of a worrying picture.
Yes, this line is what was likely to be the capacity of critical care, so intensive care unit type beds in the UK. You can see that although some of these interventions reduce the size of the peak a lot, in terms of the demand you're requiring in hospital, it's still many, many times larger than the likely capacity that will be available.
It's not enough.
Nowhere near enough.
And that's why we're in lockdown now.
Yes, so this model and a number of other ones showed that you couldn't have these single, fairly moderate interventions that would be enough to make this manageable for the NHS. That really, without more dramatic reductions in transmission, these lockdown-type measures, you weren't going to flatten the curve enough to get below this line.
This is where we were. Is it where we still are?
Lockdown measure is going far, far beyond what any of these shorter, maybe kind of slightly lighter measures are doing. So I think it's likely our case numbers are now going to be much, much lower because we've got this lockdown in place.
Is there a date in the future that we can hope for lockdown to start to be lifted?
It will probably be looking at the period of a few weeks. In China, for example, they had a lockdown of about 2 months before they started opening up. Other countries in Europe are now starting to think about lifting things. But it's this really tough balance to strike, because if you lift it too early, you're still going to have a lot of infection in your population and the outbreak can take off again. But obviously, the longer you leave it in place, the tougher that is on a population.